I said somewhat recently, or in the future, depending on when this goes live, about the idea how I don't like there to be fluff or padding on my show. So in other words, if I don't have something to say, I don't try. I just say what I feel like I need to say, feel what I feel is worth saying, and then I let it go. And I don't try to push for, I'm just going to ramble on about stupid crap. Now I know you're looking at me like, but Arsh, you ramble on all the time. But I always try to ramble on something that I feel is at least significant, or at least worth knowing. So forgive me for my segues, but that's just kind of me. My point being, I'm not going to sit here and try to come up with artificial topics to talk about. Rather, I look at the stuff that actually I have to talk about, and then I talk about it. And I don't have much to talk about on this one. It's just a damn shame, because this is an elbow episode. Now, I know what you're saying. Arsh, what the hell is an elbow episode? What hasn't actually come up yet. This is actually the first elbow episode I've covered in Voyager or in here. Lord knows Star Trek in general doesn't really have elbow episodes. Let me explain what I mean. There's the kind of episode that is, or shouldn't I say episode, there's a kind of concept in fiction of the cornerstone, okay? In other words, the stone at which the arch requires to exist. But that's more of a baseline thing. This is the establishment. This is where things begin, and then you go from there, right? And that kind of thing in fiction tends to apply in different directions. An elbow thing is a little bit more of a rare example. You don't see it that often. It's something that happens in the middle, kind of hence the term, but is absolutely critical and crucial. And I like to do this just to explain it really easily. It's super easy when you think about it. This may be strong, but without that elbow to connect them, it's basically meaningless. You have two unconnected points which can't accomplish anything in so unconnected. So an elbow episode is the kind of thing where you absolutely have to watch it. You absolutely have to play it if it's a game. You absolutely have to do it, or whatever. It is something absolutely critical that connects the former to the latter. And that is exactly what this episode is. Some people will come to me. I've had this question many, many times with a lot of different shows. Farscape is another good example of this. And they've said, I don't have time to sit and watch the whole show, and frankly, I'm only partially interested, so what can I skip? And this is actually where the concept elbow episodes come from, for me. That's where I came up with the term. Because, they would be like, well, you say to skip this and this episode, but why do you really insist on this episode? Well, that's an elbow episode, and I explained to them what I just explained to you. So this is an elbow episode. It is probably one of the biggest elbow episodes in the entire series. All that comes before is connected to this episode, and all that comes after is connected to this episode. And that's really all I have to say about that. I mean, I could discuss some of the long-term ramifications, but I'd rather discuss that when those ramifications come up, because we're covering that stuff. So I don't have a lot to say about the actual elbow joint itself, other than, don't skip this episode. If you're one of those people watching this with me, just make sure you don't skip this one. I doubt you would. This episode also has... Well, I mean, granted, Babylon 5's already started the trend of really great speeches. But this episode has an absolutely awesome couple of speeches. One from Jakar, actually two from Jakar to be blunt, and one from Londo. The one at the beginning is wonderfully over the top. One of them has vanished onto the aether. I'm paraphrasing. And the other has chosen the most breathtakingly inconvenient time to choose pursuing new career opportunities, like becoming a butterfly. I love that speech. So, I also like the loyalty the random Narn pilots show to Jakar and to Narn in general. That is a very Narn thing. Narn, no doubt, at least I theorize, by virtue of having ground into the heel of the Centauri for so long, it's at that point where a Narn, I get the impression that if there's a Narn here, and there's another Narn over here, and this Narn hates that guy. However, this one over here is being attacked, or hurt, especially by a non-Narn. This Narn would still probably walk in to help him because he's a Narn, because that's just kind of the way they work. That's the way they think, and the way they function, and the way they operate. And that makes perfect sense to me. It's also very interesting to me because of the whole... Well, let's just say that there's a lot more to be discussed about Jakar that I will discuss in the future. I've debated discussing it in this episode. I've decided to leave it aside. But remember how I mentioned his character arc was basically beginning in Chrysalis, the end of Season 1. This is where his character arc is really starting to take strength. His speech he gives to Londo, it's not a speech. He tells Londo, the differences between our people will only ever be solved by Centauri blood, but for right now we're willing to put that aside. That was powerful. This is Jakar saying that. Think about that for a moment. And I also like the logic in it. I've said for many years that the enemy of my enemy is not my friend, that it's not actually a logical conclusion. You know, I've said in fiction, just because a bad guy is opposed by someone else does not make the person who's opposing them a good guy. It makes them someone who opposes the bad guy. And so I like the idea of paraphrasing, if I may. We may not be friends, but we can be allies. And I like that perspective. It's also funny because in real-life history, that's how several long-term friendships between countries and nations and powers has actually happened. We hate each other, but we've got that to deal with over there. And they spend however many years dealing with that, and you spend a few years working together with a group, it's a little harder to go back to hating them afterwards, you know? We see here the first seeds of what could be a true Narn and Centauri resurgence. The only thing that could possibly screw that up is some guy named Mr. Morden. So Mr. Morden, first of all, we see once again that Londo is a complicated person. He's not actually that good of a person. He is willing to ask for another of these little demonstrations because he understands the ramifications of that, and he is a very ambitious man, a very politically savvy man, and someone who understands the weight of such things. He does a great performance here where Morden's like, oh, well, you know, just choose your target. And he says, I want to take out the Narn homeworld. And Morden's response is, one step at a time. That scene is absolutely chilling. In that one moment, we see exactly what this threat behind Mr. Morden is. We don't even need details. To them, taking out the homeworld of one of the major powers of the entire galaxy is something that's on the table. It may not be easy, but it's on the table. They could do that. And, well, maybe they couldn't do that, but they think they could. They believe they have the capacity to pull that off. And that really says something. And you could see Londo's face. He gets the impression on that one, too. I think that's one of the reasons why Londo decides to agree to his deal with Mr. Morden. Remember, what's the price for these favors? You know, oh, well, any information on the rim. When you... First of all, Londo understands the value of favors. As I mentioned in the previous, two previous episodes ago, back in Chrysalis, he understood what he was getting into, and he was desperate enough not to care. So now, even though you get the strong impression he does not actually want to share this information with Mr. Morden, he has to. And I get the strong impression he regrets sharing this information with Mr. Morden. But he already made the deal, and he's absolutely terrified of these people. And he should be. So I feel personally that's one of the reasons why Mr. Morden dropped that line about one thing at a time. Not just to get across how confident they were in their abilities, but to subtly threaten Londo, to demonstrate how much they do not give a crap, and are more than willing to take whatever they feel stands in their path. And that kind of would bully Londo into capitulation. And it works, so there you go. Yeah, that line. A very tiny point, the alien machine comes back. It saves Garibaldi's life, or at least we think it does. Woo, that's pretty awesome. There's actually a amusing subplot. There's basically, 4 plots in this episode? All very, very important. The subplot, though, I'm going to go ahead and say this now. I think, unless Babylon 5 is trying to be clever, they're being a little bit too obvious with President Clark. In this episode, they play dramatic music when he announces, I'm taking over the investigation. And then they point out the obviousness of how Clark himself rose to power because of a coincidence during a situation in which there was this big conspiracy to kill President Santiago. And, on top of that, the ship that was sent to investigate is mysteriously lost. And that man, the aide, is gone. Now, Babylon 5 is more than capable of subtlety. It is entirely possible there's someone else pulling the strings and Clark is the fall man. Who knows? But they're clearly trying to make you think Clark is a bad guy here. I mention that, though, because they've already pulled this kind of trick before, with Jakar. as I said before, Jakar was designed to be an obvious, obstinate, bureaucrat, jerk-ass bad guy, and already we've seen by the beginning of Season 2, he's starting to shift into what will eventually become his more concrete character arc. So who knows? Maybe they're going some direction with that. Now, what? Whoops, I forgot to mute my phone. I usually do that before I record. One other thing I do want to mention, though, with regards to the aid situation. So, I got the impression, feel free to contradict me on this, that Garibaldi's aide actually didn't really want to kill Garibaldi. He had to. It was pretty much required of him. But the way he, when Garibaldi is just upset about it, and Garibaldi's a very personal man. He's a very, I don't care about facts. So, or, no, I shouldn't say facts. He's one of those kind of people who takes a lot of umbrage and takes things personally. Very emotional, in other words, right? So for him, being personally betrayed by someone affects him personally, and he wants to know the personal reason. Why did you betray me? Not why you had this part of this big conspiracy. That's something else. That's later. Why did you betray me? And the man, it's the only question the man actually really answers is why I betrayed you. Because I was under orders. And I like that because I get this impression he didn't really want to. Like, it was not something... Like, I could picture him on the phone with whoever's giving him orders, saying, do I have to? I mean, Garibaldi's like my mentor. He's helped me for all this time. All right. He also gives that speech about being on the right side. And I don't think he was doing that because he believes in the cause. I think he was trying to, in his own desperate way, convince Garibaldi that he was on the right side and Garibaldi should switch paymasters accordingly. Who knows? This could be all speculation. If that is true, it would mean his final taunt to Garibaldi wasn't a taunt at all. It was a hint. It was a clue. Interesting take on it, don't you think? Yeah, so he's gone. He's screwed. We're never seeing him again. I haven't talked about Sheridan that much yet. Most of Sheridan's take in this episode is him being a human again. His reaction to, I'm going to offer to give some of my life to Garibaldi as well. That's pretty nice. There's this great scene when Garibaldi wakes up where Garibaldi says, I don't know you. And he says it quietly and distrustfully, but Sheridan says, no you don't. But I have a feeling we're going to get along just fine. That line right there, I really feel like was supposed to be the audience speaking to Sheridan. I don't know you, but we're going to get along just fine. And as time will prove, the two do get along quite well. So hey, credit where credit's due. So it is very Sheridan to offer of himself to take care of his people. He is in many ways a Cisco or a Kirk-style commander in the trenches, if you will. I also I love the humanity about his plot arc, about his lost wife. There is something utterly, utterly human about that I cannot... I don't even have words for it. It actually did make me feel the way that Box Leitner portrayed a man who was utterly heartbroken. Here in real life, I've noticed in my 33 years that there are two kinds of people when it comes to dealing with grief. There are people who adapt and move on, and there are people who just kind of carry it with them forever. For the record, I am one of the latter. I am still sad to this day of things that have happened in decades past. I don't really get over the death of a family member, for instance. That's something that just sits there, and I'm reminded of it every now and again, and I grieve them in my own way. Now, it doesn't mean I'm this wandering ball of doom. That's too far in the other direction. But my point is, it's clear based on this presentation that Sheridan is one of those people, too, that to him, it doesn't matter that it's been 2 years. His wife is dead. That's something that will never go away. Now, he will move on. He will adapt, as I have. But he will not simply accept it. He will instead challenge it for the remainder of his days. That being said, him being able to see that final message from her had to have been some of the most amazing closure. That had to have absolutely settled his soul. I can't even imagine what that would be like. Except I can. I've lost family members I didn't get to say goodbye to. Quite a few, actually. I have one grandparent and one grandmother and one grandfather left. I used to have a lot more than that. So, Jakar's speech was actually really, really nice. I loved his thing, weep for us all. I love how he's kind of defeatist about the whole thing too. But the great thing he mentions there, there's a very powerful race, which means either a new race or an old one. And I like the implications there. Now, the obvious statement they're trying to make is that this is an old race. What I love is the idea of a new race coming in and just completely usurping the balance of power. And the reason I love that is because we've already had that happen in this universe. Humans. Humans are very recent to the galactic field, and they have completely destabilized and changed the galactic political arena. And I hate to draw this into Mass Effect again, but in Mass Effect, humans just kind of came out of nowhere. They were a new race that completely changed the political field in a similar fashion. And again, I love the idea of that. So, it is actually left to our imagination whether this is an old race or a new race. And I mention that because even though Jakar himself is very clearly saying this is an old race, it was mentioned in Jaquan. Notice how the religious thing is starting to tie a little bit more into his character, by the way. It's in the Jaquan. You know, I feel it's an old race, it's one of the old things, blah, 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 blah. You know, that he keeps mentioning it over and over, but he does not have to be right. We, the audience, can make up our minds as to who is actually correct about this thing. Although we do know there's a threat out there because we do know Mr. Morden is connected to it because Mr. Morden is warned about the situation, and then whoever they are deal with it appropriately. Give me just a second. I'm reading down my notes. I've already said some of these things. I mentioned the Clark thing. I guess that's kind of it, actually. There's so much in this episode that's important. We find out Mr. Clark, President Clark, becomes, actually has some screen time in this episode. He's taking more of the foreground. And we know there's some kind of conspiracy back on Earth. That's a plot thread that's just been brought up in the aid, the assassination. We know Jakar's back, and we know there's some kind of ancient threat or new threat. Some kind of threat. Let's just say it like that, which is tied to Mr. Morden, and by consequence to Londo. We know that Delenn has now changed into something new. I like the fact that it's portrayed as very painful, by the way. Not because I want Delenn to be in pain, but because that makes perfect sense. Fundamentally changing your physiology would probably be very painful if you're conscious for it. That's kind of probably why she was supposed to stay in the cocoon, but whatever. That's also very logical as to why she called Dr. Franklin over to help her. Even though there's a contradiction in that, because she clearly knew what she was getting into. And she clearly called for Dr. Franklin, knowing Dr. Franklin, a human doctor, could help her with her new morphic, hybrid, human, whatever physiology. However, she then has the line, "What am I?" And we see her with the scales. That was a fairly blatant and badly written attempt at audience misdirection. It's one of the only sour points in the entire episode. And I've been accused of being an apologist for Babylon 5, so I'm going to make it a little bit more of a point to point out when the episodes fail, in addition to constantly gushing about how freaking amazing they are. And of course we learn about Sheridan, and one of the things that helps to drive Sheridan, one of the reasons he is so work-oriented nowadays, and the guilt that he had carried with him. It's a great episode, but unfortunately I don't have much else to talk about it. Next week, we'll be talking about a few more things, but again, next week's episode probably wouldn't have anywhere near the impact, if not for this one's elbow episode. You can use that one yourself, go for it. Either way, I'll see you next week, guys.